weird because wasn't they on the same side almost? No, Constantinople was the head of the Eastern Church, and these Crusaders were mainly from the Western Church. So for a time, the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, whichever one you call it, was occupied by the Crusade rulers and the forces from the West. And this did have a pretty good impact on the commercial expansion because of all this shipping going back and forth to haul the Crusaders and their gear and supplies, etc. The shipping in the Mediterranean increased the trade in the Baltic and the North Sea. And also, these crusades and the feudal system kind of brought a sense of order to these other unwise, unruly tribes. With this trade, guess what happened? Increase of a class of merchants and an increase of the power of these merchants. And they're turning the towns and cities into centers of power of their own right. So we have, three kinds of power struggles going on, three different ways going on. But there were some benefits to this new wealth coming in because of this time prior to the 1200s, we saw increased churches, cathedrals, churches being constructed, schools, universities being founded, leading to learning. And so this is the background of that age of unrest that we're going to move into. We have a slide here of the church family tree onto it. Reason showing this is prior to, for about 400 years after the Pentecost, when you talked about the church, there was only one thing you were talking about. The church was founded at the day of Pentecost and expanded for about 400 years. But as you can see, some splits started happening into here. The first major split, the Assyrian Orthodox split off because they didn't like what happened at the Council of Ephesus in 431. The next, the Oriental Orthodox Church split off because they didn't like what happened at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And 600 years later, as a result of what's called the Great Schism, 1054, was a major split, and that's when the Eastern and the Western churches started going on their separate ways. So we had then this period of time from 1054 to 1517, almost 500 years, you had four branches of what we would call the Christian church. The Asian Assyrian Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, and the Western Catholic. And these churches weren't all intermingled, maybe a little bit on the fringes, but mostly they were regional. Each region had its own particular brand. I thought it was interesting, this chart also had some of the major Protestant denominations. Not all of them, that tree would be too big. But some of the major ones, and I know you can't read it, but they're all into there. But what the point was being here, if you look at the trunk, if you will, of the Protestant denominations, it is the Western Catholic Church of the Middle Ages. And that's that period of time we're going to talk about the popes and what they decided and how they ruled. That's today's lesson on their leaders, their philosophies, their character. Because these things impacted the development of the church as we have it today. When you start shaking a family tree, you need to be prepared for everything that might fall out. The good, the bad, and the ugly. See, we hope they're going to be kings and queens and nobles and knights, but they could be horse thieves, bandits, and murderers that fall out of a tree. And whatever falls out of that family tree is part of your heritage, whether you like it or not. Okay, moving on to it. And it was pointed out there's several of these things going, and I got about 2 minutes for each one, and I've already spent some of them. My intention isn't to read that part that you have onto there. You can read onto it. And I know it gets confusing using Roman numerals after these guys' names, but you Super Bowl fans shouldn't have any trouble at all with Roman numerals. Okay, the first one, Celestine. His big thing was he was the first pope to resign in office. And there was a problem with that because it could be argued wait a minute, all these other popes lived until they died, and then we elected a new one. You can't resign. Well, if he did resign, what was the status of his successor? See, you had this pope that was supposed to be pope till he died, and then you had this pope that was elected. Two of them happen quite often during this, as you're going to see. But that was the big thing onto it, and as a result of him resigning and causing this consternation amongst his successor, Boniface VIII had him captured and imprisoned and put him into a castle until he had died. Next we have Boniface. He had quite a few things that, as your handout says, he was a pivotal and highly controversial figure. One of the controversial things he did was he issued a papal bull, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it. It's in Latin. But anyway, this bull limited the power of kings to tax the clergy. He says, you kings can't tax the clergy anymore. And in retaliation, the French says, okay, you're not going to ship gold, silver, or any other valuable commodities out of France anymore to Rome. That kind of put the bishops that was in France into a little bit of difficulty, because how could they send the wealth to Rome? See, it wasn't just all roads that led to Rome. And King Edward in England, he says, well, if you're not going to let us tax them, then we're not going to protect you anymore. So therefore, you're not going to have any protection. And for those that don't know what a papal bull is, we're not talking livestock. This is a term for an authoritative decree issued by the Pope, usually written on parchment, written in Latin, and sealed with this thing called a lead bulla. B-U-L-L-A. And that's where the bull came into, and the papal is the Pope was issued it. And it's supposed to be almost like some of the Ten Commandments when he issued that papal bull. Another thing he did was he established in 1300 a first, what he called a holy year, a jubilee. And he granted plenary indulgence. What? What's plenary indulgence? It's ensuring immediate entry into heaven upon death. You get this if you visit the tombs of the apostles into Rome. What's the benefit here? Think tourism. And also, he issued another bull, the Unum Sanctum. I can almost pronounce that one. And that declared the Pope has absolute authority over spiritual and earthly powers. And it stated submission to the Roman pontiff was, quote, absolutely necessary for salvation. And the French didn't like this too much, so in response, they sent a guy to bring Boniface back to France for trial. Well, in response, the Pope says, well, I'm going to excommunicate the king. Remember Ambrose way back when he discovered this power to control the monarchs? Continuing on and on and on. But anyway, and they had trouble bringing him back, so the king got this Colonna family to attack the Pope in a town called Anagai, and the Pope escaped from it. And quite often through this book we're studying from, the Colonna family in Florence becomes an important thing. And I'm wondering, is that one of the earlier mafia branches? Because they're always involved. They're involved in political. They're involved in this and that. Okay. I should have just let them all roll up, shouldn't I? We'll do that now. Okay, next we come to Benedict. And 8 months was about the only time that he was able to serve, and that's because soon after he was elected, 8 months later, he died. And he showed loyalty to what Boniface had done, and he remained, as a cardinal, he remained on the Pope's side during all the discussions and arguments about whether or not that was done. And he was unanimously elected by this College of Cardinals. Everybody was in favor of him because they figured he was be the one to reconcile the church with France, with its other countries, with its enemies. And he was able to lift the excommunication of King Philip of France to restore peace. But before he could move along with any of his other programs, he expired. So then we come to Clement. And also on your handout, I listed what nationality these people were. And you notice they're all Italian until we get to this guy, Frenchman. Well, he started what's called the Avignon papacy, and claiming the instability of the Rome and its environment, he established his residency in Avignon. And another book says, no, he stayed in Avignon because he kind of liked his hometown after he got elected pope and didn't want to move to Rome. But it brought the papacy, the headquarters from Rome, over to Avignon. There we go. You can see where it came to. And also, to balance up this college of cardinals, this is a group that elected a pope, he created a whole bunch of French cardinals to be able to balance off the predominantly Italian college. And he was famous for nepotism and a weakness toward the French crown. He appointed a lot of his family and friends to offices. And he is also instrumental in suppression of what's called the Knights Templar. And this, mainly under pressure from the King Philip of France, he disbanded them. And basically, this group was a wealthy, influential order that was practically, if you would, the European banking corporation. And getting involved in this kind of stuff just wasn't too well received by the people. Okay, John 22, verse 12. Excuse me, the Franciscan poverty dispute was one of the things that he got involved with. This was a dispute. Remember last week when we talked about the people in the monasteries, and they got farming, they got work, they got wealthy. Well, some of the people in these monasteries said, wait a minute, the apostles weren't wealthy, why are we wealthy? So they became this side, and the other side says, hey, we became wealthy, we deserve it. So there was this argument among the Franciscans themselves over, do we get rid of our wealth and become poverty, or do we keep our wealth and enjoy it? So he issued another bull declaring that the guys that wanted to be spiritual and not get rid of the wealth, they were heretic. And he did assert that Christ indeed did hold property. I tried to find out what they were talking about and what it was, and basically all I know is the clothes he was wearing when he was arrested, if you're going scriptural. But it led to a fierce battle between the two of them, and the battle expanded out of that into, okay, all the other problems with the church, authority and messing around in secular matters, whether God could be known by faith alone or whether we had to go through the priest and the pope to get to know God. All could be seen as seeds of a reformation being planted here at this early stage. And it was nice that they all posed for photos. One of the things I forgot to mention about John is this beatific vision. He had a series of sermons, or whatever he does, I want to call them, he argued that the souls of the just won't see God until after the general judgment. You know, you might go to heaven, but you're not going to see God until, you know, why this even came up, I have not a clue because I couldn't find anything, but it did cause an uproar amongst all the learned people of that time. And he eventually retracted that view on his deathbed. But and he had a clash with Louis IV because he didn't want to recognize him, since he was a Bavarian. He didn't want to as a Holy Roman Emperor. So, leading to Louis's excommunication again. And Louis retaliated when he just brought his troops and invaded Italy, and he set up his own pope. They call him an anti-pope in the literature, Nicholas V. But he's not listed in this list because this list comes from the official list. And a fake pope isn't going to make the official list. So then we come to Benedict. And he issued a bull, settled this controversy. He says, don't worry, folks, you are going to see God when you get to heaven immediately after death, and you won't have to wait till the white throne judgment. Everybody has, so, whew. And also, he initially wanted to return the papacy to Rome because there was a lot of pressure from the Rome and from Italy to get the headquarters back into it. But he eventually says, no, we'll stay with Avignon because maybe it was a lot nicer community, I don't know. But he started the construction of a massive fortified place called the Palace of the Popes. And he did have evangelistic reform. He was a former Cistercian monk and an inquisitor. He tied with the Inquisition, a guy that asked the questions and you better have the right answers. So he enforced strict discipline on the monastic orders, and he required the bishops to reside in their own diocese or their areas of influence, their areas they were in charge of. I thought that was interesting. You're living over in Avignon, France, and you say, I've got to live in my capital city? Interesting. And he had some political challenges in that he was pope during the 100 Years' War when it started. And he had ongoing conflicts with the Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV, as we had read about earlier. He got excommunicated, but he did reconcile Europe by reinstating Louis IV. It's almost too much stuff, isn't it? Okay, Clement. He was the fourth of the seven that ruled from Avignon, France, and he had some real problems. He served during the time of the Black Death, and to help alleviate the pain, maybe, I don't know what he was helping to alleviate, but he granted general remission of sins to all who died of the plague. Now, maybe this was an incentive or an inducement. You don't have to go to confession. Just go get plague and get dead. But anyway, and to manage this massive number of casualties that were happening during this time, he consecrated the Rhone River so that the bodies could be cast into it and still be considered having a Christian burial into the sacred ground. See, there's ways around any problem you want to get into. And the popular hysteria blamed the Jews for the plague. That sound familiar in our times? I mean, you got to find somebody to blame. So he did argue that the plague affected the Jewish people as well as it did those. So let's not be blaming them, but let's let them move into here when they're being kicked out of other countries. But another thing that he did, he lived like a secular prince. He significantly expanded this palace of the popes, filling it with art, music, and expensive tapestries. And also, under the indulgences and jubilees, he issued another bull and officially defined the treasury of merit and the Pope's right to deal with this treasury of merit. And he reduced the interval between these Holy Jubilee years from 100 years to 50 years to allow more pilgrims to visit Rome more often, increase tourism. See, I always look at where's the money? Where's the money coming from? What's this treasury of merit? Well, I typed it in, a question. The infinite merit of Christ plus the superabundant merits of the saints who did more good than necessary for their own salvation comprised the wealth into this treasury of merit up into heaven. And it can be distributed to believers via indulgences. And remember, indulgences, you give the church some money, they grant an indulgence of some sort of. And these indulgences mainly were to shorten the amount of time that you would have to spend into purgatory. And I think they based that on the store up yourself treasures in heaven. Possibly. And also that sovereignty of Avignon, he purchased the city of Avignon, even though that they already were living there for a bunch of 40-some years. He purchased that to ensure that they would have a permanent sovereign home in France. And at the same time, remember I said the 100 Years' War started between France and England, and the popes being French were, guess which side they were on? This gave the French revenue from their war efforts against the English. Then we come to Pope Innocent VI. He was a dedicated reformer. He wanted to eliminate corruption. He wanted to reduce extravagance in the Avignon court. And he, again, wanted to force bishops to live in their own areas. And upon his election, he annulled this thing called a capitulation. And this was a thing, agreement that the College of Cardinals made that would have limited the power of the Pope in favor of the power of the College of Cardinals. And he says, well, I'm the Pope now. Scratch that document. It's not working anymore. And he did get involved in a peace treaty that put a halt in the temporary halt in the 100 Years' War between England and France. And while they were off in Avignon, the family feuds in Italy started going to which family's going to be in control. And he sent an agent there to get that stuff sorted out and settled down, and he was pretty well successful into that. And then comes a different kind of bull. This is the golden bull, not to be confused with the golden calf. This was a bull coming the other way. It was a decree by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, and it provided the legal framework for the election of a king and emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And guess who got left out of that group that was going to elect the king and the emperor? The Pope. You're no longer involved in choosing our leader. Wasn't received too well. Urban V, as said under there, he was counted as the 200th head of the Catholic Church. This made me kind of wonder about a rabbit trail maybe, but how come he started being calling popes about 1054 and already have 200 of them? Because about 1054 is when them bishops started saying, the Bishop of Rome started saying, I'm the supreme bishop and all that kind of stuff. And this means they had 200 popes in less than 300 years. Well, I know they was a short time span, but not 1.5 years. Well, if you go on and get an official list of the popes, they start with Peter. And for some reason, I don't know how they did it, but they've got a pope all the way through, and with the given name and the pope name and the years they've reigned, et cetera, which brought me up to, I alluded to earlier, why do they change their name? As you see in your handouts, every one of them had a name that they was born with, but they took on another one. And Peter got a new name from Christ. So was Pope. I need to get a new name. And I'm not going to say from Christ, but you can jump to that conclusion yourself. Anyway, he was the 200th. And he did have efforts to return to Rome, but political unrest after he was there for a short time forced him back shortly before his death. And he was a patron of learning called a scholar pope, and he founded and supported several major universities, and he worked aggressively trying to get against clerical abuses such as the sale of church offices, the sale of many church offices to the same person, and wanted to just go for better moral renewal amongst the clergy. Gregory, he did return to Rome on 1377, but his death shortly after the return sparked another crisis called the Great Western Schism. And this kind of gets ahead of itself a little bit, but Urban VI was elected after Gregory XI died, and he was elected to bring this all together, but he didn't do it too well, so the cardinals got together and elected another pope, especially the French cardinals went to Avignon and elected another pope. And this started what's called the Great Western Schism, with disputes over who is the real pope. Will the real pope please stand up? That was an old TV show, to tell the truth, a long time ago. Some of you remember that. But he also had some conflicts going on in Italy. Those coalition of Italian city-states infiltrated by the reigning families in Florence. They still kept the pot stirred up, and he had to deal with that. And also, he condemned the work of John Wycliffe. And had John Wycliffe put to death. You remember John Wycliffe? He was one of the first to really stand up and criticize the wealth and political power of the church. He translated the Bible into Middle English, making it accessible to the common people rather than just the Latin-speaking clergy. And he maintained that it was not necessary for priests to mediate between God and man, and the Bible, not the church hierarchy, not the Pope, was the ultimate authority for Christian belief and practice, and he vigorously opposed that doctrine of transubstantiation. Do we remember that doctrine of transubstantiation? That's the belief that the bread and the wine during the administration of that, it actually became the body and the blood of Christ. But anyway, John, sounds a lot like the beginning of the Reformation, doesn't it? That's because it was. But anyway, we're ready to move on to that next Urban that sparked that Western criticism, or schism. And this schism, the one France electing a pope, the cardinals of France electing a pope, the cardinals of Italy electing another pope. Well, the French sided with this one, the Italian sided with this one, the German, the other countries were left to choose which side you're going to choose up with, because it was a big thing. And the reason for that other one is that When he was elected Pope, Urban, his harsh, abrasive leadership style alienated all of his supporters, specifically the Italian supporters. So 13 French cardinals decided, nope, that election was invalid, and we voted that way because of duress from the Roman mob, and we're going to elect this rival pope, Clement VII, and we're going to take our ball and go home to Avignon again. See, initially, this Urban was respected as a devout and competent administrator, but after he became the Pope, he became known for his harsh, ill-tempered, and violent behavior. We come to another Boniface, and during his administration, he had to face two different anti-popes that was elected out of France, and he had pressure from the major European powers like England and Germany. Why don't you go ahead and step down to end this split? But he says, nope, I'm not going to do it. And while Rome was strapped for cash because of the constant wars and the loss of the traditional revenues because of some actions of previous popes, he introduced this concept of when you get elected to a church office, your half of your first year's income comes to the church. And also, since that didn't bring enough in, I don't think Brad liked that idea. No, I'm just kidding onto that. Aggressive sale of indulgences, and also creating new positions so that you can have more people coming into those new positions to get half of their first year's income. And he was successful in settling things down into Rome itself with those feuding Italian families. And he did get involved in Naples politics by supporting and crowning a king to help him expel the French forces from southern Italy. Remember earlier from one of those that come in and did it. Come in because of the actions of an earlier pope. So we have another innocent. Shortly after his election, a group of the Romans revolted against his authority and forced him to seek help from this king that his predecessor Boniface had supported. And he also, his nephew murdered 11 members of the Roman opposition, and even though he wasn't directly involved, the ensuing riots forced him to another town for nearly a year, and because of his distrust with another one, he stalled the peace efforts for ongoing peace and unrest. Gregory, he was the last pope to resign, and he resigned for some good reasons until 600 years later, there was a resignation in 2013, but I thought that's a little too close to home to go look up, and somebody's interested into it, that'd be a homework assignment. But he did resign to end this Western Schism, was a purpose for it. They said, I think there was 3 of them at the time. They said, if you resign, I'll resign, and we can have a council to elect a new one with a clean slate to start all over. So we quit this back and forth business of it. It was called the noble act of abdication. And what the Pope purpose was is to preserve this legitimacy, this authority of the office of the Pope that he did resign. Well, after they cleaned the slate out, they elected Martin. When I looked at that picture, I thought, holy cow, he must love potlucks. But his election did end the schism, and it brought the church under one legitimate pope. And he come back into Rome, restored it, got rid of some of the poverty and the ruins that was into there, and began a massive reconstruction of the churches and the palaces and the public works. And he was successfully reasserted the power of the Pope over this thing called a conciliary theory. And this was a theory that argued, I should say councilary, not conciliary, councilary. It argued that because the church councils were the ones that elected the Pope, maybe the church councils in the hierarchy order were above the Pope, and the Pope then should answer to these church councils because they elected him. And he said, no, that's not going to happen because the Pope is still the Pope. And then also the book talked about his involvement in this Hussite wars. You'd think that that was a war with another country. I thought that until I looked it up. But what were these Hussite wars? Well, conflicts in Bohemia, we talked about a little bit earlier, sparked the execution of this, I would say Jan Hus, but they probably said Jan Hus, in 1415. And this Jan Hus, he was opposed to the idea of the unquestionable authority of the popes and the cardinals. He was opposed to the corruptness of the clergy. He was opposed to image worship. He was opposed to false miracles and what they called superstitious pilgrimages, tourism. And he's also, at that time, I don't know if it still is or not, the practice of during the communion, you got the wafer, but the priest got the cup of wine. And he says, no, the communion to deal with the body and the blood. So they should be. But anyway, that's what John Huss got him in trouble with the Pope for and got him executed. And after that, his followers started an uproar that became known as these Hussite Wars, which most of Martin's time was spent trying to suppress that movement in Bohemia, and he authorized several unsuccessful crusades against these people. Eugene. Again, we have the Colonna family coming up. To get some money, Martin gave a lot of the Colonna family, his relatives, lands and wealth. And Eugene thought, no, we need to get that back. And that's the conflict that he had with those folks. And he also had that struggle with the councils, again, about this councils refusing to disband, thinking they were more powerful than the Pope, and electing anti-popes. And because of the political instability and the insurrection caused by this Colonna family, it forced Eugene to leave Rome in 1434. He left disguised as a monk, escaping down the Tiber River while he was being pelted with stones and possibly even curses. Kind of reminds me of David leaving Jerusalem when his son Absalom was after him, didn't it? Anyway, we come to Nicholas. He initiated a massive program to restore Rome's infrastructure and monuments. And he began plans of a new St. Peter's Basilica, and he brought an end to the schism with a Council of Basel and secured the resignation of the last anti-pope Felix, effectively bringing all Western Church back under the authority of one pope. And he was a patron of humanism, inviting the great scholars of the country to come and translate the Greek text and the Latin. I had to look up for sure to what was humanism. It's a doctrine emphasizing a person's capacity for self-realization through reason and generally rejects religion or the supernatural, which I thought was an interesting thing for a leader of the church to be dabbling in. But he was. But anyway, the final split of the East and West came not because of anything the East or West did, but because of the Muslim Turks captured Constantinople, and therefore, since the capital was gone, there was no more friction between the east capital and the west capital. The next pope, because of the capture of Constantinople, he wanted to get a crusade going against it, and he prioritized the defense of Europe, even selling papal jewels and halting building projects to be able to fund that war effort. And he did have victory at Belgrade, which is instrumental in stopping the Turks' invasion, halting the Ottoman advancement into Central Europe for roughly 70 years. But it wasn't a total victory, because eventually they came in. And he initiated this ringing of the church bells at midday to remind everybody to pray for the success of the Crusades. And one of the things that noted, he did have a ordered a retrial of Joan of Arc, formally declare her innocent of the charges of heresy for which she had been executed. I thought that's pretty nice, but kind of like getting the Medal of Honor for you posthumously. Come to Pius, his primary goal was to keep on launching this crusade against those Ottoman Turks after the fall of Constantinople, but he couldn't get the traction going onto it. He couldn't get enough people to come along with him, and he died waiting for this fleet that was supposed to come and launch against him, and it never happened. And he did transform his birthplace into this ideal Renaissance city, named it after himself in his own honor. And he issued another bull condemning you can't appeal a pope to a council. See, again, bringing back the order, the pecking order of it, and reinforcing the absolute authority of the pope. This guy was involved in a conspiracy at a failed attempt to assassinate a person of the Medici family, another family in Florence, powerful Italian banking family, political dynasty that effectively ruled Florence. And he also, nope, I'm in the wrong list. Wrong list, sorry, my hand moved. Paul II. He introduced some carnival festivals to Rome and revised the city's municipal statutes. It was one of his notable efforts. Think of the bread and circuses in Rome. And he abolished the Roman Academy and imprisoned several humanists. See, he's going back the other way now from the guy that was siding up with him. And he also had conflict with the cardinals, and he set aside these capitulations, these binding agreements that the cardinals wanted the Pope to sign on to, saying, no, we're going to have authority over you, Mr. Pope. Now we come on to the part that I was already on to. There was a failed attempt to assassinate a member of the Medici family in Florence, and he was personally involved into that attempt. He also authorized, under pressure from King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel, remember those guys? He issued a papal bull establishing the Spanish Inquisition, though he later did condemn their extreme abuses of it. And he famously elevated many relatives to a higher office to secure his power. 6 of his nephews was made cardinals, including a future pope, Julius II. And he promoted the dogma called the Immaculate Conception. I always thought that was just the name of a church, but further research found out this was a doctrine. The Virgin Mary was conceived without stain of original sin in the womb of her mother, St. Anne, by special grace from God. I'll just leave that there. Another innocent, which he probably wasn't, he issued another bull which formally recognized the existence of witchcraft and it authorized the inquisitors to use brutal measures to combat it. And this document provided the foundation for these widespread witch hunts we read about into Europe. And again, family and nepotism, like many of his predecessors, unlike many of his predecessors who hid their illegitimate offspring, see, because they're supposed to be celibate, he was the first pope to openly acknowledge that he had illegitimate children, and he used his position to secure advantages in marriage and political power for those illegitimate children as well. And to combat a depleted treasury, he increased the sale of church offices and created hundreds of new positions so he would have more to sell, of course, to the highest bidder. In dealing with political relations, he had a marked conflict with this king of Naples. And you remember Boniface IX supported that king of Naples, and the next guy called him in to help fight, get rid of the French from southern Italy. But this guy had a unique arrangement with that Ottoman Empire in that one of the sultans, a brother of the ruling sultan, was a rival. So this pope had the brother as a guest, effectively a prisoner, in exchange for the sultan giving him a substantial annual pension and the gift of the Holy Lance. I never heard of a Holy Lance before, so I had to look that one up. This is supposedly the spear that was thrust into Jesus' side while he hung onto the cross, which made it a very famous historical artifact. That same guy that I talked about earlier saying the only way to start a meeting on time was to start on time, they took a trip down to Mexico, and he said, well, while we were down there, we got to see the descendants of one of the donkeys that Jesus rode into Jerusalem. He was quite a character, always trying to see if you would catch on whether he's telling the truth or pulling your leg. And this kind of goes with earlier portion I'd had is this interest of saints, this interest of relics of saints to have in your possession so that you would have these things available to take care of and worship. Okay, Alexander, he was of the house of Borgia, and this was a Spanish family, and he aggressively advanced his family's power and wealth. And he had some famous children. One of them was Cesar Borgia. He was a ruthless military leader. And his daughter, Lucretia Borgia, who was used as a political pawn in various strategic marriages to start bringing the power and consolidating and cementing alliances. And also, all of his children were well provided for at church expense. And he negotiated a treaty that established this line of demarcation that was used to settle what countries in America between Spain and Portugal, who would get what. And he was a major supporter of the arts, commissioning people like Michelangelo Putricino to embellish the Vatican and the Sistine Chapel. And again, he showed widespread tolerance of the Jewish refugees being expelled from Spain and Portugal. And he restored order to a crime-ridden Rome by dividing the city into districts with their own law enforcement. So now we come to just kind of a summation of the 15th century church decline. It was a period of deep institutional crisis characterized by internal corruption, political power struggles, loss of spiritual authority. And while it ended with the church as the most powerful force in Western Europe, the, quote, rottenness of its hierarchy and the growing gap between the wealthy clergy and the suffering laity set the stage for this Protestant Reformation that came. Some of the major internal crises that they'd had was, as said again, the Western Schism, the administrative corruption, the clerical morale, decay, and worldly ambition were reasons why internal causes of problems, external causes of problems. They had to deal with the Black Death. You had the increase of the national state, which kind of led into a national church rather than a universal church dominated by one person. And it also the rise of humanism and critical thinking. And we kind of think of critical thinking as a very good thing, but when you start to also, critical thinking can be related to let's find ways to see why these old biblical things aren't really what they thought they were. That kind of critical thing. From our intelligence, from our reason, from our things, we're going to come to an explanation of stuff rather than what did God say about that stuff. Way ahead of myself onto that one. But and early reform movements, John Wycliffe, as we mentioned before, Jan Hus, they began to openly challenge the church authority and promote everyday speech type translations of the scripture so that people would have it, could read what it actually said rather than listen to somebody tell you what it says. And these laid the groundwork for later dissent. And also accompanied with that was economic decline. The church's economic power began to decline as it focused more onto maximizing its wealth. A number of places, the active church parishes actually declined, and the state began to take over some of the social services that they had received money for. And as church services became more ritualized and less participatory, you sit there in the audience and let us professionals take care of things up here. People started going toward a more private, personal devotions rather than to a church-led worship service, all of which brought about the Age of Unrest that set the stage, was the background for what we are and have today. Our Father, we're thankful for this peek back into our history. Sometimes we don't like what we saw, but we just ask that you would watch over our decisions, our efforts, our beliefs, that we don't fall into some of those same things that we look back at those people and say, why would they do that? Because being humans just as us, we could easily fall into those same thinking, same heresies. And we need to constantly come back to your word, to what you said, and put that in our hearts. And all this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.